Hi everyone, welcome to the December 15th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragon, and I'll be joined in just a moment by my co-host Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to recap some racing from last weekend, focusing primarily on Gulfstream Park, where they ran 4 stakes races on Saturday, 4 graded stakes races actually, topped by the Harlan's Holiday, won by the returning Tax. That card also included the Grade 2 Fort Lauderdale, which is an interesting race to discuss from a pace standpoint, and we'll get to the other 2 dirt races on that card as well. We'll also mention a very impressive first-time starter that we saw on Saturday at Gulfstream Park. Then we'll move on to some other racing that took place at Aqueduct, Fairgrounds, and even one race from Tampa Bay Downs and Los Alamitos to close out the show. But Craig, we're going to start at Gulfstream, and pretty good card on Saturday. They had some interesting stakes races, and we saw some nice performances.
Yeah, it was. I'll start by saying I'm glad we don't really do a forecast recap because it wasn't my finest effort. But as a fan watching, yeah, it was some solid efforts, definitely some surprises, some not so surprising results, and I think you said it right to start with Harlan's Holiday, even though it was only a Grade 3 compared to the Grade 2 of the Fort Lauderdale. I thought it was the most eye-catching performance for sure. We had seen Tax not look too good in his last couple of efforts. He had been off since May, but he came back, and as you noted on the forecast, he had been working really well, and he ran to it. He jumped out with a big 121 TimeformUS speed figure. He took control of the race early, and basically it was over. I think I tweeted out headed into the turn, no way Tax should lose from here, and he didn't. The margin just got bigger as they got closer to the wire.
Yeah, he did get away with a pretty soft opening quarter, and when you draw the rail going that mile and a 16th distance at Gulfstream, that's always going to be to your advantage, especially if you're a horse with speed. And he did play the brake and get up close to the front right from the start, and they did pick up the pace down the backstretch, and I think that's when you saw the horses that were chasing him, like Royal Earn and Todd Weege. They came off the bridle, and even though the pace doesn't look fast from a pace figure standpoint, it was a race that kind of fell apart behind Tax, as the second, third, and fourth positions were all dominated by closers, and Tax was just visually impressive in winning this race. He'll face some tougher tests moving forward in the future. I imagine they're going to try the Pegasus World Cup next time out, but given the form that he's in now, I think he's a horse that definitely has to be targeting those races.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I do want to mention this is a race we have coded in bright red as highly speed favoring. Personally, I think the track was pretty fair, to be honest. I mean, we use an algorithm. Almost all the dirt winners were wire to wire or something close to it. But in this case, I think it was more circumstances than any specific track bias. I do want to say, it's possible. Speed certainly wasn't a bad thing to have, but it's not something I'm going to downgrade the horses that won on this card running on dirt when they come back because of it.
Yeah, speed did look good. Just apparently from all the results, horses that were up close to the pace or on the lead, they did win the dirt races, but I didn't notice any kind of path bias. Being on the rail didn't seem to be an advantage. So I tried to look for a reason why speed might be winning these races. Didn't seem like kickback was a big issue on this day like it sometimes is at Gulfstream. So I agree with you. It might have just been circumstances in the way the races played out, because a lot of the races that we saw on the dirt did feature differing pace scenarios, and we'll get to that in a little bit when we talk about some of the one-turn races. But before we get to those, let's talk about that Grade 2 turf race that took place on this card. That was the Fort Lauderdale run right after the Harlan's Holiday, and kind of a funny results chart to look at, because you had 4 horses that were single-digit odds in this race. Halliday, Factor This, Some Like It Hot Brown, and Delaware. And they were the last 4 horses across the wire, just upsets all around. And Largent, who was Todd Pletcher's other horse in this race, he got the job done. Really has done nothing wrong in his career, but I know I personally never thought of him as a graded stakes kind of horse.
No, I didn't either. I mean, I seem to remember us talking about him when he won at Gulfstream earlier in the year. I think he ran some fast figures in an allowance race. But yeah, he never had that Grade 2 look about him. What was particularly surprising is the way he did it. It was pretty fast pace, obviously, as we suspected. The pace projector kind of late into that, and we kind of saw it as well when we talked about it. But coming up with Argent, I think, was a different story. Got to give Paco Lopez full credit. He was much further back than that horse has ever been. Timed his run perfectly and just finished. And it's one where I didn't particularly like the favorites because of that pace scenario. It played out, but you still got to find the winning horse, which isn't always easy. Hats off to those that came up with Argent, because I couldn't do it. But he got a 120, which kind of matched his tops from early in the spring, and a little bit on the weak side for a grade 2 race, but decent enough effort from him and just disappointing for the favorites.
Yeah, none of those horses that were fancied in the wagering showed up, and it was really a couple of 4-year-olds who were actually. Doswell might be a 5-year-old. I've got to check on that because I know that he's missed some time. Doswell is a 5-year-old. But a couple of horses that were coming out of some lesser races, allowance races. I know Tom Pletcher let large and clear all of his allowance conditions before trying some restricted stakes races, and even took advantage of the fact that he's a Virginia bred by racing him at Colonial Downs and Laura Park once in some lesser races. But he handled the step up in class here, and I agree with you. I mean, the way he did it was kind of surprising. He won decisively here, earned the best speed figure he ever has before. And I also want to give credit to that runner-up Doswell, who was making his stakes debut here. This is a horse that had started out in Chad Brown's barn. Now he's with Barclay Tag. He had won both prior starts for Barclay, and this was his stakes debut. And I thought he ran really well to be second, because when Largent was making that decisive move on the far turn, Doswell got caught inside a little bit. His rider tried to take the inside path and ran into a couple of those speed horses that were tiring. He ultimately got through on the rail late, but I thought both of these horses ran well. Yeah,
and Doswell was just as surprising. He had won his last 2 wire-to-wire as well, and he also was able to come from off the pace for Junior Alvarado. So it just goes to show, particularly on turf, how tricky it can be. Horses are a lot more likely to be able to adapt to a different running style on that surface than what we see on dirt. So it makes things tricky, even when you get the pace projection right. As you say, it doesn't mean things are going to play out exactly as you suspect.
Let's get back to those dirt races that they ran on Saturday at Gulfstream. And the fourth race on the card was the Grade 3 Rampart, going the 1-turn mile. And this one was won, unsurprisingly, by Latruska, who I thought was actually a little bit of an overlay as the 3-2 favorite in this race. I didn't choose for us to discuss it on the forecast last week because I assumed she'd be a pretty heavy public choice here. She just looked like the best horse coming in, and when they let her get away with some moderate fractions, it was all over.
Yeah, I was equally surprised by those odds. I figured she'd be in the 4 to 5 range at best. But given some of her performances that we saw in New York this year, but she just toyed with this field. She did something I wasn't sure she could do, and that was actually slow it down early, and she had no problems with that. All the fractions are coded in blue, and she just drew away for the easy win. She got a 1:13 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, but I personally think she had more in the tank than that. That's largely a function of how slow the pace was early. And again, this is one of those that are coded in red for being speed favoring, but I think with those kind of fractions, she was going to win on any track.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting that they actually took the blinkers off for the first time in this race, and it really did allow her to settle more on the front end, because the last time we had seen her in that Beldame, I mean, she just ran off with, I believe, Kendrick Carmouche through the early stages, opened up about 7 or 8 lengths on that field, just setting some crazy fractions, and she understandably faded that day, going the mile and an eighth. So they made a change for this race, and obviously she was facing a lesser field than she was in the Beldame, but it seems like taking those blinkers off have really made a big difference with her. So if she's able to relax up front and have that dimension where she can go fast or go slow and still finish, that's a real feather in her cap moving forward. Let's move on to another wire-to-wire winner on Saturday at Gulfstream, and that was in the Grade 3 Sugar Swirl, going 6 furlongs for the fillies and mares. And Ladies Island did it a bit differently than Latruska, because she did go quickly up front, as she always does. It's basically, you know what you're going to get from Ladies Island. It's just a question of whether she can hang on in the stretch. And she just barely did hang on, though there was a little bit of controversy towards the end of this race.
Yeah, there was. She barely hung on, but she wound up with a 112 Timeform US speed figure for the win. And kind of like the last race we talked about, the real surprise for me, at least, were the odds. I never in a million years dreamed Ladies Island would be 9-2, or I definitely would have picked her on our forecast. I thought she would have been the favorite, but they wound up betting the Brad Cox entry of Cinnabunny, who had some trouble in the lane, changed her running style, wasn't able to get up, but just exactly what you'd expect from Ladies Island. She's just fast, catch me if you can, and they couldn't quite get there. Personally, I thought it was probably the right call from the stewards. I'm not sure anybody was beating Ladies Island without the traffic trouble they had late, but I'll let you talk a little bit more about that, see what you think on that.
Yeah, it was really tough to tell. It was a situation where, sure, Ladies Island was drifting pretty badly through the stretch, but I think the real question that needs to be answered with regard to the inquiry was how far clear was she at the time that she started drifting? And I mean clear of the other horses, because it is legal from a steward standpoint to drift all over the track if you want to, as long as you're not interfering with anybody. And I would have liked to see a side-by-side of the pan shot and the head-on at the same time, so you could see exactly when she was coming out, and if a horse like Cinnabunny had gotten within a length of her at that time, and if she was really cut off, or if her rider was just trying to find room where there wasn't room as Ladies Island was drifting out. So it's a tough call. I think the horse that was arguably cost the most was Sound Machine, who was fourth. You can make a case that Ladies Island drifting actually cost her third. But it's just a tough situation, because do you put Ladies Island fourth for that infraction? I don't really know. And without seeing those two shots side by side, I feel like I couldn't make a real call. And obviously the stewards didn't make a call, even though they have access to those angles. So I just thought it was a tough decision to make. Cinnabunny, though, I do want to say, she disappointed, I guess, a little bit as the even money favorite. I also didn't think she'd be that short, or else I wouldn't have picked her in this race. But she did have trouble at the start. She broke a little bit slowly, and that just took her out of her game right from the beginning. And she did show a new dimension in being able to come from off the pace. It just didn't quite work out. She couldn't get there late.
Yeah, and we should mention, for grade 3 older fillies and mares, a 112 isn't exactly the strongest figure, so it's not like I'd be looking to bet Ladies Island back off this race. If anything, I'd probably look at Cinnabunny, but even that one, all of these horses are going to have to run a little bit better if they step up into stronger company than what we saw here.
Now, early in the day at Gulfstream on Saturday, there was a race that got a lot of people talking as a 2-year-old debuted, one that looks like he has a lot of promise. That was Prime Factor for Todd Pletcher. This horse was going 6 furlongs, showed good early speed, stalking a front runner who he just kind of inhaled at the quarter pole, and he drew off impressively through the lane.
Yeah, he did. It was a very nice performance from him. He's quality road colt out of a Bernardini mare, so I assume he's going to be pointed to longer races at some point. But he got a 106 Timeform US speed figure for the win, which is really good for a debuting 2-year-old even this late in the year, and just looks so good doing it. It's obviously this one has a bright future. It's hard to say what he beat in here. The 4-5 favorite, Semper Fidelis, was a horse who had only run an 83 last time. I was really surprised how heavily this horse was bet, and he actually ran that same 83 this time and was only able to finish 5th. So it just kind of shows how these 2-year-olds can change so quickly. And I don't think you want to be betting too many of these horses that they look good first time out as 2-year-olds, but they don't run particularly well when they're a short price like this. And Prime Factor was the one that was able to take advantage, but and clearly, I mean, he won by over 8 lengths, I think it was. He's the one you want out of here, and I imagine he's going to be moving in the stakes company pretty quickly.
Yeah, Semper Fidelis did have a much higher buyer figure. And I know some of those figures at Gulfstream Park West, they don't always translate to Gulfstream Park, and it's hard to exactly say why. It's almost like the Finger Lakes to Naira situation. Some of those figures, they just don't really hold up. And I was a little surprised, too, that they bet Semper Fidelis as strongly as they did, even with that high buyer number. But Prime Factor, I mean, they paid $900,000 for this colt as a yearling. He's owned by Windstar and China Horse Club, similar connections to Justify. And you can see why when you look at this horse's female pedigree because, as you said, the dam is by Bernardini. She is a half sister to Speightster, who I believe won the Dwyer. He's a promising sire now, as a son of Speightstown. The second dam, Dan Swiftly, she's a full sister to Dan Smartly, that Breeders' Cup Distaff winner and Canadian Triple Crown winner from the early 90s. So just a ton of class in this female family, and certainly the kind of pedigree that would suggest that this horse could stretch out and go 2 turns in the future. So I just think a lot to look forward to at this one. Before we move away from Gulfstream Park, just one more race to take a look at, and that's from this past Wednesday, an allowance race going a mile on the dirt. And that was, again, won by another Todd Pletcher horse, this time War Stopper. This horse is making his first start for the Pletcher barn after beginning his career with Rudy Rodriguez, coming off a long layoff here. And I know he's one that we had talked about last winter because of his impressive maiden victory, and it seems like Todd Pletcher's got him back on track now.
Yeah, he does. I think he's a horse. I'm pretty sure I picked him last time out, and he just didn't run well at all in the Gotham. He led early before packing it in, but he sure came back from that long layoff nicely. He got a 118 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, and I think this is going to prove to be a very strong race. It's one where the top 3 all ran 113 or higher, and while they look like they made pretty big jumps, I mean, they did make some big jumps. They had all shown promise earlier in the year, and there were other mile races on the card. I do time those from video to make sure, because Trackus struggles a bit with those mile races and the really short run-up. So I'm confident in the figure, and Warstopper looked really good. I would like to see him show a little more versatility, maybe come from off the pace a little bit, because he did have things his own way up front, but he drew off impressively through the lane, and the 118 is a stakes level type of figure.
Yeah, and I don't think it's a big surprise that he could run a number like that because, as you said, you had picked him in the Gotham off of that impressive maiden victory at Aqueduct, where he ran a 111 in January of his 3-year-old season. So I think it's just natural to assume that a horse like that could improve to a 118 by December of this year. And Todd Pletcher, he's just always so dangerous off these kinds of long layoffs, and he had this one ready to go. As you said, the pace wasn't blazing. It was pretty moderate, actually. But I like the way this horse just kept plugging away and took some challenges on the far turn, turned those horses away, and finished up strongly. Seems like one where distance shouldn't really be an issue with him, given his pedigree. So I'd just be interested to see where Pletcher plans to go with him, because you would imagine off a performance like this, he could step up to Stakes Company next time.
Yeah, for sure, and I don't think it's too soon to say. It looks like it's going to be one of those Todd Pletcher years at Gulfstream. It might be time already early in the meet to start giving his horses some extra credit, because all his horses are just running holes in the wind right now.
No, Pletcher's always been upfront about that. The 2 meets that he really gears a stable up for, Saratoga in the summertime and Gulfstream Park in the winter, and he's certainly come out firing these first few days down there. Let's move up to Aqueduct, where they ran one stakes race that we'll discuss from last weekend. That was on Saturday, the Alex M. Robb, and a minor upset as Bankett got the better of Mr. Buff. Bankett just worked out a perfect trip in this race as Jose Lezcano had him a little bit closer to the pace than he's been in some of his recent starts, and he just took advantage of an honest pace up front and a Mr. Buff that probably wasn't at his best.
Yeah, that was a subpar Mr. Buff for sure, I think. And after that, I mean, it just wasn't the strongest field. The horse I like, City Man, broke through the gate early, so probably saved me some money. I was able to cancel that bet. He ran terribly, and it was just almost kind of a battle of attrition when the better horses didn't show up. Bankett was finally able to get the job done. I mean, he hadn't won in forever. I know I bet him several of those times when he was in that losing streak, and had finally mentioned on the forecast that I'd given up on him a while ago, but he looked good doing it. I think it's one of those where he got a 116 TimeformUS speed figure. He ran basically the same kind of numbers that he always runs. It was just a case that nobody else really showed up.
Yeah, and Mr. Buff had excuses in this race. Obviously, he was coming back in just a week after not running well on the Cigar Mile. And also, he blew the start of this race. He broke last, had to rush up to challenge Seafoam for the lead in the opening furlongs. The pace wasn't fast, but I think anytime a horse breaks last and has to rush up to contest the pace, that's not ideal when you're dealing with a front runner. That said, Still feels like the old Mr. Buff would have gotten it done in this race, and it's just more and more starting to feel like he's lost a step. These are the types of races that Mr. Buff was supposed to dominate in the past, even when horses like Bankit were in them. So maybe they'll give him a rest now. I think he's earned it, but I wonder if we're going to see the best version of Mr. Buff come back.
Yeah, it's interesting when you look through Mr. Buff's PPs and our TimeformUS past performances. He's only had 2 short layoffs in his whole career for a horse that's run 40 some races. So it could just be that he needs a break. Maybe it would be, a freshening for him. And when I say the blue lines, I think that's a 90-day or more layoff, but not 180 days. So you don't often see horses with that many starts who have just never really had any kind of break, because he's obviously stayed in training that whole time and just been a warrior. But at this point, maybe it is time.
I believe the second fastest race from a speed figure standpoint after the Alex M. Robb this last week at Aqueduct was a maiden race on Thursday, this one for the older horses, as Malibu Star for Kelly Breen led his entry mate home, as these two were well clear of the rest of the field going a mile on the dirt. And Malibu Stars had an interesting career. He began with Bob Baffert when he made his debut as a 2-year-old, but now he's a 3-year-old with Kelly Breen, and it seems like Kelly Breen's got a pretty talented horse on his hands. Yeah,
it looks like he finally put it all together. I mean, he ran pretty well first couple times out. He's always taken money at the windows. He's progressed each time. He went from an 86, then he had a long layoff, jumped up to a 97 in that return race at Monmouth, in a race that didn't feature a lot of pace. And then this time he just exploded to a 113. It was a really impressive performance for both him and the runner-up for his stablemate, as you noticed, because it was basically a football field back to the other. So really strong maiden race, and I'll be curious to see where this one shows up next.
Yeah, I have not made it to the racetrack very, very much this year with the pandemic happening, obviously. I did get to Monmouth Park a couple of times, and one of those trips was on October 14th, and just happened to see live that maiden race where Full Impact beat Malibu Star, the 2 Kelly Breen horses, and it's just kind of funny that that's turned out to be a key race, because Full Impact, Malibu Star's stablemate, he came back and won an allowance race at Aqueduct, looks like a horse that's full of promise, and now Malibu Star came out of that race and significantly improved his speed figure and won this race so impressively on the stretch out. So Kelly Breen's got a stable full of some horses that could easily take that next step forward up to stakes company. Some real promising sorts. And you look at Malibu Star's pedigree, and he's a horse that definitely could do better stretching out in distance. He's by Giant's Causeway. He's out of a horse that raced primarily in Japan on the dirt, but you go deeper in his female family, and he's actually a descendant of Personal Ensign. So just a really nice pedigree on Malibu Star, and one that I'll be looking forward to in the future, because off this kind of maiden victory, he's one that could step right through his allowance conditions.
Yeah, and that's actually a race where 4 of the top 5 had come back to win. One of the horses won at Tampa on Wednesday, I think it was. The 3rd place finisher, the 5th place finisher has also come back to win. So probably too late to call it a key race now, as most of the horses that have won up from it already have, but certainly proven to be a strong contest.
One more race to look at from last week at Aqueduct. That was a 2-year-old maiden race on Sunday, going that demanding 1.125 distance around 2 turns. And this is one that coming in looked like you might see a promising performance, because a lot of pedigrees, a lot of horses that had shown promise in their early races. But a mild upset here, as Chad Brown's risk-taking got the job done. This is an odd horse for Chad Brown, because usually Chad's horses are ready to fire first time out. Usually he knows exactly what they want to do in their debuts, whether he places them in sprints or on dirt or turf. I mean, he just kind of has these horses pegged because they're so well schooled in the morning. And this is one of those horses that he had to try a few things to really figure out where he fits. And it turns out routing on dirt, well, that's what this horse has wanted to do all along.
Yeah, it sure does. I mean, he obviously made a huge jump this time out. As you said, he had sprinted on dirt, routed on turf without much success. Never hit the board. But on this day, he ran a 102, did it running easy, winning pretty easily, won by over a couple lengths, and just a really impressive performance. I do want to mention there was another 9 furlong race on the card immediately prior to it, but it was that stakes race that just had the crazy slow pace. So that one was broken out for pace, and basically this race was rated by itself. So it is one you want to keep an eye on, as the top three all kind of took big jumps, but I don't really have any problem with the figure here. I mean, I do look at the sprint races, and it was a pretty solid, there's a pretty solid relationship between the 1 and 2 turn races at Aqueduct, and I think it held up here. So my main point is you really can't compare it to that earlier stakes race, this one race before, because of the pace, but it's still a solid figure in my opinion.
Yeah, this is a horse that I remember was supposed to have some ability when he made his debut. Got bet down to 4-1 that day and really showed absolutely nothing. I mean, until the race was over. He did gallop out very strongly in that debut, but it's debatable how much that means. They tried turf because he does have some turf pedigree on the dam side. That didn't work out. But in this race, he was just a much more professional horse. And they also put the blinkers on this time, and he traveled much more in the bridle than he had in his prior starts. You could tell coming to the half-mile pole that he was just moving the best of the others. And once Jose Lezcano steered him out into the clear, he just mowed this field down and looked good doing it. Obviously, distance is not an issue for a horse like this, one that breaks its maiden going 1.1 miles on the dirt at Aqueduct. So it'll just be interesting to see if he can get a little faster in the future, because I think he'll need to if they have intentions to run him in stakes races.
Oh, sure, and I do want to mention Rock Sugar, even though he was beaten a couple lengths in here. I thought he ran pretty well at the 1 1/8 too. He's certainly bred to go long. He's out of Frosted, who's we talked about earlier, has been pretty exciting freshman sire, so he looked a lot better around that second turn as well, and I wouldn't think he'd be a maiden very long.
Let's visit another venue on this podcast, one that we haven't talked too much about recently, and that's the Fairgrounds. They began their meet there at the end of November. They ran an allowance race on Sunday that was won by our old friend from the Derby Trail last year, Blackberry Wine. This horse was actually crossing the wire first for the 4th time in his career, though I think this is just the 2nd win for him officially, as he wins his non-winners of 1 allowance condition in this race. I didn't get the speed figure yet in the TimeformUS charts, but it looked like a relatively fast race to be comparing it to the other races on this day, and he did win by open lengths.
He did. It's not one I do the figures for. My assistant does, but looking over the worksheet, I would put it pretty solidly. It's going to be around a 118, give or take a point. So I think that's right up there with his close to his career best. He did run some pretty quick races in the spring. Whether they actually counted or not's another story, as you mentioned. But it was a good performance by him, and he showed that he's much better second off the layoff than off the bench. Certainly some of it was the easier competition in here. It wasn't the strongest field at all that he had to beat. So if he was even a semblance of himself, he should win, and he did. But he did it easy enough that I would expect there's some future there, and stakes will be in his probably next time out, I would imagine, with that kind of number.
Yeah, watching this race, I did think it was a little weird that Adam Beschizza rode this horse as hard as he did to the wire. When you're winning by over 5 lengths and you're a horse that's kind of on the comeback trail, you would think he'd try to give him an easier race. But, I mean, he was whipping and driving this horse 5 lengths clear of the field all the way down to the finish, which is just kind of an odd visual. But he did run a fast number, and based on those performances, as you mentioned, from early in his 3-year-old season when he was also running some fast speed figures, you'd imagine that he would still have forward to go. We'll see, because obviously he's a horse that some doubt was cast on the things he accomplished over the winter. So we'll see what he can do now that he's returning and moving into his 4-year-old season. Moving on to another venue that we don't often visit, at least at this time of year, Tampa Bay Downs. This was a race, I wasn't really aware of it at the time, but as I was combing through the charts this week, I noticed this 2-year-old maiden race from last Wednesday at Tampa that was won by this first-time starter Witzel. 13-length winner, went back and watched this race, and boy, was it just as impressive as the chart would lead you to believe. I mean, he won by 13 lengths, and unlike Blackberry Wine, who was ridden out to the wire, I mean, the jockey barely asked this horse for anything through the last quarter mile of this race, and just won with such ease for pretty low-profile connections. Just a race that's going back and worth watching.
Yeah, when you sent this one in your rundown for the show today, I was like, who the heck is Witzel? Because when I make the figures, honestly, I don't look at names. Of course, I'll go back and look it's some, but I didn't notice the margin was so big on this one. And when I looked, I've never heard of the trainer, Carlos Munoz. Doesn't look like he has a particularly good record. He has a win percentage less than 5%, but he certainly got a good one here out of Nyquist. He got a 99 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, and he actually did it knocked down from a 102 final time figure. We do have some of the figures coded in blue, but personally for 2-year-olds like this, I really don't mind seeing that, even though we knock it down a little bit. I like when they're able to rate a little bit, ration their speed, and really finish up strong. To me, that usually bodes better for the future.
Yeah, and this horse, obviously, he's going out for some connections who probably haven't had a horse of this quality before. As you said, I looked up this trainer's stats over the past 5 years or so, and he typically only wins a handful of races on the calendar year. 2020 is actually one of the best years he's had so far, winning 6 races. So just pretty cool to see a horse of this quality debut for connections that probably have some cheaper horses in their barn. And I mean, he is a son of Nyquist, and we've seen these Nyquists the first year that he's siring runners. They can really perform and run some faster speed figures. Obviously, he's the sire of Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies winner Vequist. So I wonder what's going to happen with this horse. He's the kind that I wouldn't be surprised to see show up in a different barn next time, because to horses that debut like this for low-profile connections, they typically do get some offers for them. So we'll see what happens, but this does appear to be a horse with ability.
Yeah, that was my exact thought. I wonder how long they'll hold on to this horse for when I saw the connections. But you never know. It just depends how ambitious they are and what kind of offers they get. But the horse certainly looked like he's worth some pretty serious offers.
Moving on to our final venue of this show, that's Los Alamitos out in California, and no real stakes racing to highlight this week, but there was a maiden and allowance race that we should talk about. On Saturday, they ran a 5-furlong allowance race on the dirt course for older horses, and Mr. Vargas, who has accomplished his career highlights on the turf, but is a horse that's handled dirt many times throughout his career as well. He just ran this field off their feet. There was a ton of speed signed on, contested pace, and he just kept going.
Yeah, this was quite a performance from him. As you said, most of his biggest wins have come on the turf, but he got a 118 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. We did have it a little bit slow early, only a 107 pace figure at that first call, but he just drew away from there. Nobody else was even able to give him much of a warm-up, and there were some pretty decent horses in here. I mean, Sparkyville's been a stakes performer who we've talked about many times, albeit mostly on turf as well, but he does have a grade 2 win on dirt in the San Vicente as a 3-year-old. So this was an impressive performance for Mr. Vargas.
Yeah, for a horse who's 6 years old, he really hasn't raced that much in his career. I think he's only raced I want to say 12 or 13 times, if that. And he did accomplish that stakes victory on the turf last summer at Del Mar. But you always talk about how some horses just really like Los Alamitos. And if you look through his career, he's actually a horse that's done this before at Los Alamitos. I think he's actually 3 for 3 there in his career. And even though he might be a little better on the turf, this Los Alamitos dirt surface just seems to agree with him.
Yeah, he is 3 for 3, and he actually ran a 126 back there in July of couple years ago, I believe it was 2018. But yeah, he's a horse who certainly seems to like that surface, and he's actually got a good dirt record at other tracks as well. So he's versatile, and given the state of the sprint division out west, I mean, maybe he could jump back into stakes company, because a 118 would have won some pretty good races last year.
And let's wrap up the action at Los Alamitos and on this podcast with one more race from that venue on Sunday. That was a 2-year-old filly maiden race going a mile. And this one was won by Moonlight Doro for Richard Mandela, a filly who was making her 3rd career start, but was stretching out around 2 turns for the first time. And she certainly finished the way you would want to see a juvenile finish when they're trying a route for the first time.
Yeah, this is another race from Sunday that don't have an official figure for, but there were a couple other routes at least on the card, so it looks like to be a fairly easy number, and I came up with I would guess it's going to be about a 102, give or take, maybe a couple points higher even in this case. But yeah, just a really good performance from her. She beat it was basically a match race on paper, and that's the way it turned out on the track with the Bob Baffert trained Frosteria, and it wasn't much of a contest. She just tracked her early, put her away at the top of the lane, and looked really good doing it. So this looked like a filly with a future to me, who probably won't have any problem with any extra distance.
Yeah, what I liked most was the final quarter mile because they really threw it down. I mean, Frosteria was finishing in this race. It's not like she was tiring at the end, and Moonlight Doro just really stretched out her body and put that filly away and was running right through the wire. I just love the way this horse finished off the race. She's owned by Spendthrift Farm and My Racehorse Stable, the same connections that own Authentic, this year's Kentucky Derby winner. And this one, though, is trained by Richard Mandella. She certainly has a pedigree to suggest she's supposed to be nice. On the dam side, her dam by Bernardini is a full sister to Wilburn, who won one of those Midwest Derbies, I think the Indiana Derby a couple years ago. And Frosteria, who was second in here, as you said, the Bob Baffert trainee, I mean, she's also got an awesome pedigree. She's a daughter of Frosted, who has been siring plenty of runners in his first crop, and she's out of the dam Hysterical Lady, who was a Grade 1 winner during her racing career. So both of these look like fillies with futures. Well, that's all the racing to cover on this week's podcast. We'll do the TimeformUS forecast this Friday. We'll get that in before next weekend's holiday festivities and maybe a bit of a holiday break. We'll see what stakes racing there really is to cover this week. I think there's not much. I know at Gulfstream Park they're running the Mr. Prospector and another stakes race on the turf. So maybe we'll look around the country, Craig, and try to find a few things to talk about. And also, I got my Clips Award ballot in the mail yesterday, so I'll try to sift through that. Maybe we can talk about those on one of these upcoming podcasts.
Yep, mine arrived yesterday as well. I was going to mention that.
Well, everybody, thanks for listening this week. Remember, you can always catch us on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for tuning in, and make sure to check out our TimeformUS forecast this upcoming Friday.